So the world of religion in general, the world of freedom of religion or belief, is of concern for the entire society. And this is the reason why we can easily speak about the connection between the well-known 5 Ps, so the 5 areas of particular importance in the G20, and religious groups and religious communities. So when it comes to people, for instance, we can see that we should be aware that religion or belief is an essential part of the identity of people, that religion is often, and most often I would say, not a factor for conflict, but a powerful force for good in society. And even, there was a comment by someone in Matera, even when the religion might be the source of conflict, or rather, very often, when the misuse of religion is a factor for conflict, religion is at the same time part of the solution to these type of conflicts. If we focus on planet, we can see that was another interesting point made in Matera, that most religions embed in people the notion that we are part of a bigger system, whatever the interpretation of that bigger system is in your tradition. But religions instill in people the moral responsibility to take care of the environment, of this bigger universe in which we all live. If you depart from, for instance, of the creationist approach to the understanding of the universe, you will see, well, this is part of the gift that God gave to humanity, and therefore we have to take care of it. Prosperity, we can see not only the big contribution that many religions make to the realm of education, for instance, or to health institutions. We have seen that in this terrible period of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also religions tend to reinforce a sense of moral responsibility in society. That includes, for instance, the principle of equality between all human beings, which tends to underscore the significance of treating women equally all around the world, which is one of the big challenges we have in these societies. Peace, there is no durable peace system that does not rely on the fundamental freedoms. So if we want to achieve a peace that is going to last, we need to support it with the respect for all human rights, and among those human rights, in a prominent place is the freedom of religion or belief. And this is the only way we can create societies embedded with a culture of dignity. And finally, partnership. We have seen also in this period how important it is that religious communities interact with the state in the persecution of the common good of societies. So this is only possible when both parties, political or secular political institutions and religious institutions, they acknowledge the identity of each other, their respective realms of legitimate autonomy, and they cooperate with each other. So this is where the atmosphere of the discussions in the meeting in Matera. There is some document still to be drafted with some recommendations that were emerging from that meeting. But I would underscore that perhaps some of the most important points would relate to the understanding that protecting freedom of religion or belief is not just a private interest of religious people or religious community, is a paramount public interest. All society should be interested in the protection of this fundamental right, and that religion or belief is part of the identity and the dignity of individuals as well as groups. And therefore, every restriction that the states think appropriate to impose on freedom of religion, because freedom of religion is not an absolute right, there are no such a thing normally as absolute rights. Every restriction should be based on objective and specific reasons, and they must be necessary, strictly necessary, and proportionate. And again, this has been one of the factors for discussion, for debate in the last months, when we have seen all these restrictions imposed on individuals and on communal life because of the pandemic of COVID-19. And one of the discussions that have emerged virtually in every country in the world is to what extent the religious life, especially the community life of institutions, can be legitimately restricted by the state, and how this should be on equal basis in comparison with other non-religious groups with other fundamental rights. So we cannot impose on the religious lives of a community different or stricter restrictions or limitations than the ones that the state impose on other types of gatherings, for instance. And okay, well, and again, we have seen that these institutional channels of communication between the state and religious institutions should be something permanent. It's not something that we have to do only in times of emergency, like the pandemic of COVID-19, but these times of emergency, I would say they cast a new light on this type of cooperation and partnership between the state and religious communities. So without it, this was a brief introduction to the things we were discussing a few months ago in this Italian city of Matera, and some of the people we have here as speakers were in the same meeting. We have Cole Durham, Professor Cole Durham. He will be coming late, so he was supposed to be the first one speaking, but he had another commitment just at the same time, so he will be coming, but a little later. We have Elisabeta Kitanovic, which is the Secretary for Human Rights and Communication in the Council for European Churches. We have Zheng Xiaojun, Director of the Institute of World Religions in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We have Nicolas Miller, which is Director of the International Religious Liberty Institute at Andrews University. We have Juan Navarro Floria, Professor of Law in the Catholic University of Argentina and President of the CALIR, the Argentine Council for Religious Freedom. And we have finally Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière from the Department of Law and Criminology in the University of London. So we have started a little late. We will try to be not so unpunctual in finishing the session, but I think we perhaps about 7-8 minutes per person could be appropriate, so we can have some time for discussion if we can. So Elisabetta, you have the floor when you like.
Thank you, and good morning to everyone. So I have been one of the participants in Matera meeting that Javier just explained how we dealt with this topic, that religion is not part of the problem, but actually part of the solution. And in this session, Freedom of Religion and Belief from Rights to Action, I will present our project that we have been just awarded by the European Union, actually European Commission and the International Security Fund Police for ensuring the security of the worship places. So we could see that the reality in the public space has changed. And that means that occasionally in Europe and in the countries of the European Union, we have certain security threats and challenges and risks that we need to counter. European Commission actually has issued a document which is called the EU Action Plan to support the protection of the public spaces. And in the public spaces, there are also worship places like synagogues, mosques, churches, Buddhist temples, any sort of temple. For this occasion, European Union has issued also the EU Quick Guide to support the protection of places of worship, and also organized the EU Operators Forum, where European Commission has the task force from the 27 representatives, focal points from the Ministry of Interiors, participating together with practitioners in the discussion related to the challenges, risk of the protection of the worship places. So as Europe, it's a predominantly Christian continent. You can imagine how many churches there are in our continent. continent, how many church buildings, and in general, how many religious buildings, how religious heritage in Europe, it's rich. So we have so many synagogues, mosques, Buddhist temples, churches, and the rest of the religious communities' property, which now needs certain protection. Of course, the level of the threats are not the same for every religious community or for every, let's say, building or the church property, but security of one person is also security for all. Ensuring security for one community is ensuring security for all communities. And this is why let's say, from words from rights to action, we have actually made consortium, which consists from the European Jewish Congress, from their Security and Crisis Management Center, Conference of European Churches, Muslim-based organization, which is called Faith Matters, and European Buddhist Union. And we have applied basically for this EU funding because the aim of our project was to increase security in and around places of worship, as well as within and between communities. And that meant basically to build best practices and to learn from bad practices how we can protect our worship places. And for this purpose, we have developed like content, videos, brochure, guidelines, guides, training materials, and so on. So as there is not too much time, just for your information, we have developed like about 10 videos. So you don't need more than 10 minutes to be aware of security threats in the public space. And this is for every individual community with no matter whether you belong to the religious or non-religious community. It is basically about the safety of all citizens, because we could see, for example, with the last shooting in Vienna, active shooter was shooting in the public square close to the synagogue, you know, like, and anyone could be a victim of this terrorist attack. So, as many times in the context of the G20, we have been talking about religious literacy for the institutions. Part of these projects was to actually respond to the need of religious institutions, and we have created this guide to law enforcement for safer and stronger communities in Europe, which has basically short explanation for the law enforcement, for police, for judges, and so on, about four religions, about Buddhism, about Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. What does it mean? If police officer wants to come to the altar in the Orthodox Church, he needs special permission for that, because this is a sacred place. So things like that. Also for the mosques, I mean, when they are going to the mosque, police officers, if they want to shake women hands with women, or what are the rules which apply to the mosque, or what are the rules which apply to synagogue, are basically written in this one. And we have translated this document into 14 languages. Part of this project also I will just present here. I think that this is in Portuguese, Professor Javier, right? Okay, so it exists also in English, but somehow we got 14 boxes, so I couldn't find the English one, but this was on the top. So this is basically the guide to protect your community, guide for leaders and staff members. And then we have another guide which is for community members. So until 23, this consortium is going to run 100 of trainings. So each community 25, which means that in the 14 countries, our task will be to raise security awareness. That doesn't mean that we want to make bunkers from the worship places and discuss these high-level security threats and so on, but just to raise awareness that people simply who are in the communities needs to be aware that the threats are possible, especially because there are some worship places where, for example, it is against theological tradition or rules or the canon law, for example, to close the door of the church, for example. The church during the worship time, it's open, it is welcoming place, and that actually it makes community very much also vulnerable, and that the kind of security threats have been posing also the issues and challenges. How do we deal with these kind of questions in the future? So if you would like to see something more about this, to learn more about this project, you can go on saske.eu. and just inform yourself. So they are going to, you will find these guidelines, because there are 3 of them, as well as this video that you can download, look at yourself, and also you can run the training yourself with some knowledge that that of course you need to do the research. Hand in hand with that, we are creating, as Conference of European Churches, a network of the people who are going to report every month the incidents, vandalization, anything which relates to the damaging of the property of the churches and their communities. Also, other partners are doing the same, what means that every month our consortium presents a report to the European Commission, Interpol, CEPOL, and other Pol organizations about the threats and incidents, rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Christian hatred, anti-Asian hatred, etc. So if you wish to learn more, you may visit this website. Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabetta. These bells are not a reminder that she went over time. This is just a reflection that we live in societies in which religion, one way or other, is omnipresent. So this is very, very reassuring. So that was definitely very much focused on this, from rights to action. What you presented were very interesting initiatives and very practical ones. So let's give the floor. Is connected Tsen Yao Jun, if I pronounce it well. Is she online? Okay. Welcome. Good morning. I'm not sure what time in China is right now, but you are here is in the morning.
Yeah, okay. Good morning. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to attend the conference. My topic is freedom of religion's belief, Chinese experience from right to actions. I want to express 2 meanings in my articles. The first one is countries have gradually established their own different governance experience and management models for freedom of religion beliefs. The second meaning is China's religious belief is rooted in the rich cultural soul of Chinese traditional culture, forming a unique religious distribution condition of pluralistic symbiosis in China. Therefore, Chinese religion emphasizes tolerance and pluralistic symbiosis rather than exclusive. This is China's innovation and achievement, and also the characteristics of Chinese freedom of religion's belief. So, the section 1, religion is time-honored. Different types of religion are present in different civilizations around the world. Therefore, since its birth, religion have been spreading and developing. Many world religions have been gradually formed in the interaction, multi-learning, and integration of different civilizations. And the structure of world religion beliefs have been gradually shaped by the diversity and richness of world civilizations. The diversity and richness of world civilization offer us the right basis for cultural understanding to promote the integration and mutual learning among civilizations. The cultural understanding of the religions beliefs, and freedom of religious belief is also a process of deepening and gradually advancement for countries across the world. Therefore, countries have gradually established their own different governance experience and management models for freedom of religious beliefs. Freedom of religious belief is a basic human right stipulated in International Convention on Human Rights. The expressions of freedom of religious belief are slightly different in different nations and in international human rights conventions. Some call it freedom of religion and some call it freedom of belief. Some countries have stipulated freedom of religious belief in international conventions from the dimensions of rights, obligations, and practice. The stipulation includes not only the principles of freedom of religious belief, but also specific provision on the exercise models and basic requirement of freedom of religious belief. Most countries in the world use the term freedom of religion in their constitutional language, clarifying that freedom of religious belief includes not only the freedom of inner belief, but also the freedom to conduct the religious practice and activities. We can say that it covers the all elements from right to actions. In fact, since 2009, China has formulated and implemented 3 national human rights actions plans, making key contribution to the development of the world human rights course. On September 9th this year, the State Council Information Office of China issued the National Human Rights Action Plan 2021 and to 2025, which specifically defines the freedom of religious belief in the civil and political rights part. China fully implements the parts of freedom of religion belief and in accordance with the law, protect citizens' freedom of religious belief and manage religious affairs. The state promotes harmonious relation of religion, adhere to the principle of independence and self-management activity, guide religions to adapt to the socialist society and protect the legitimate rights and interest of the religious personage and religious believers, which earnestly respect and protect civil and political rights. Second, the section 2 is freedom of religious belief is a long-standing base policy of the Chinese government in addressing religious issues. It's also a basic right granted to citizens by the Chinese constitutions. In Article 33 of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China stipulates citizens of the People's Republic of China enjoying freedom of religious belief. The state protects normal religious activities. It also stipulates no one may make use of religion to engage in activities that disrupt public order, impair the health of citizens, and or interfere with the education system of state. The religious bodies and religious affairs are not subject to any foreign dominance. These provisions of Constitution not only protect citizens' right to believe in religions, but also protect citizens' right not to believe in any religion. They are in line with China's national conditions and religious conditions and provide a foundation for comprehensively ensure freedom of religious belief and building a positive and healthy relationship of religions. After decades of active endeavors, exploration, and practice, China has made great strides in the construction of democracy and rule of law. The rule of law system has been continually improved, and the legislative work and religious affairs has also been continuously perfected. In fact, it has become an important part of the socialist legal system with Chinese characteristics, in which the constitution is taken as the core. In addition to the Constitution, China has tens of laws, regulations related to religious affairs, and has 2 administrative regulations, 11 departmental regulations, and over 60 local regulations and government rules that specifically regulate religious affairs. The regulations on religious affairs revised in 2000 and 2090s, focusing on safeguarding citizens' freedom of religious belief and the legitimate rights and interests of the religious circle, as well as safeguarding national security and social harmony, has been officially implemented since February 1st, 2018 to protect the freedom of religious belief more effectively. The essence of China's policy and freedom of religious belief is to make the religious belief a free choice for individual citizens. This is integration of universality and particularity laws. Universality is reflected in the protection of freedom of religious belief, and particularity is reflected in conforming to and affirm China's tradition of religious pluralism and inclusiveness. Excellent Chinese traditional culture is the product of multi-ethnic and multi-religious cultural exchange, communications, and integration in the development of 5,000 years of civilization. It advocates, appreciates the values of others as due to one's own, and the world will become a harmonious whole. China's religious belief is rooted in the rich cultural soil of Chinese traditional culture, forming a unique religious distribution condition of pluralistic symbiosis in China. Therefore, China's religion emphasizes tolerance and pluralistic symbiosis rather than exclusiveness. They prioritize not only the freedom of individual religious belief, but also respect for the freedom of others. In a country where a majority of citizens do not believe in any religion, and where a variety of religions coexist, the state effectively guarantees the freedom of religious belief and maintains.
Excuse me, we cannot hear you right now. It seems that we have lost connection with your voice. Excuse me, we cannot hear you. For some reason, we lost your sound. It seems that it has to do with your connection. I'm so sorry. No.
she could send us text to interesting.
Yes. I don't know if you, not if you can hear me. So, okay. So we're not sure what's happened to the connection, but let me say a few words of thank you and welcome that you could join us. I think we've heard much of your talk. If you could maybe send us the rest, we will share that with people. But I wanted to just say a word about Xiaoyun, how important she has been to the G20 interfaith process. Both she and her predecessor, Zhou Jinping, have played a critical role. They have been partners with us. Xiaoyun is a member of our advisory council, and we recognize all that she is doing. I have to tell you that when the G20 was held in China, she was personally responsible for finding a way that we could include the G20 process in a major conference that she had organized that addressed a number of issues, such as some of the sayings of Chairman Xi, and we are very conscious of her incredible effort in what is not always an easy country to deal with on these issues, in terms of really making a very positive contribution. And I'm just delighted to see her here today. And I think we certainly, I think we got the main points of the message. And I think one of the things that we're very conscious of going forward is that we need to find ways that the idea or the practice of freedom of religion is embedded in other cultures. And we need to try to understand how people are doing things. None of our countries is perfect in achieving these objectives. This goes for the United States. It's probably true of, it's even true of Italy. It's a fact, it's a reality of human life. But I think we can learn from each other, and the role that Xiaoyun plays with the Institute of World Religions in China is very significant for connections with Chinese groups. And so we're very thankful, and we're very sorry. We're not quite sure what's happened to the connection. I assure you, it's working at our end, but for some reason there's something broke at your end. But if you can send us the rest of your remarks, we will share those, and we're very delighted to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
Oh, your voice is back.
Now you are back. Okay.
Oh, we can hear you again. So it's working. So if you want to just...
If you want to finish...
Okay, I'll
it's working.
Just a few minutes. Okay. In summary, China's freedom of religion's belief and its practice are important guarantee for China's engagement and dialogue with the world. They play a positive role in promoting win-and-win and mutual benefit, connectivity, mutual trust, and mutual assistance among countries across the world. The international community should respect and reflect the view of the people of developing countries in a spirit of justice, fairness, openness, and inclusiveness, which is conducive to further building a community interests and responsibility between China and other countries, jointly building a community of shared future for all mankind. That's all. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much, Xiaoyun, for making the effort to, in spite of all the technological difficulties. And thank you also for reminding that freedom of religion or belief includes not only the right to believe, but also the right to behave. And how, as Professor Coldorham remarked, this is one of the big challenges. We have to reconcile the essence of these fundamental rights with the diversity of cultures in the world. And now next in the list is Professor Nicolas Miller. So, or we are sharing, you are sharing, okay. So, Professor Nicolas Miller and Professor Alexis Artaud de la Ferrière.
So thank you very much for your invitation. So my colleague Nicolas and I thought that we'd focus on the question of COVID-19 and sanitary restrictions that have been imposed on religious practice over the last couple of years. So kind of reflecting on some work that we've been doing in that area. So to kind of introduce the topic, you know, we know that the issue of freedom of religion and belief in the context of a sanitary crisis such as COVID-19 really raises several problems, but there's a central issue. On the one hand, public acts of worship or communal gatherings pose real and demonstrable health risks. We know this. This is because of the physical proximity in an enclosed space between those who participate in worship. Also because in some cases, certain rituals are inherently conducive to the transmission of infectious diseases. So we might think, for example, of communion on the tongue, sharing of a spoon, physical contact with the remains of a deceased person. It's not specific to COVID-19, but it's really come to the fore recently. On the other hand, the protection of public health should not discount the public's right to religious freedom. And restrictive sanitary measures may be, indeed, they've been found by numerous courts to be disproportionate with regards to the objective of preserving public health. So as we begin to perceive the perennial nature of sanitary crises for our societies, really seeing this as not just a momentary crisis, but something which we'll have to deal with in the long term, it becomes apparent that it's going to be essential to establish a framework that can guarantee the continued respect of religious freedom whilst also safeguarding public health. Such a framework requires a commitment from public authorities who must show restraint and proportionality in the application of restrictive measures affecting the exercise of religious freedom. And it also requires a commitment from religious groups and individuals who must recognize, as it's been mentioned already, that the right to manifest one's religion is not absolute, and that their religious practices may precipitate health consequences far beyond their own persons and far beyond their particular religious communities. So in response to that situation, a number of scholars gathered together in a conference last December in 2020 under the aegis of the Religious Liberty and COVID-19 Research Project, which was convened by Nicolas Miller and me, and which notably Cole Durham helped organize. And that meeting subsequently led to the drafting of a white paper, Religious Freedom During Public Health Emergencies, Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic. And what we'd like to do here very briefly is just to outline 6 key recommendations which come out of that document. So I'll just briefly kind of talk about 3 of them, and then Nick will talk about 3 of them.
And they have and they're in the handout.
Yeah, so I did put out a handout so you can just kind of see them as bullet points, although they're more developed in the full document, which is available online. So the first key recommendation is that restrictions on religious freedom in application of necessary health measures should be strictly proportionate to and solely justified by the current risk to public health. And further to that, the restrictions should be especially narrowly tailored when they pertain to activities which are considered by the religious community to be either sacramental or related to religious worship obligations. Given the central importance of religious practice to people's expression of conscience and belief, which is often inextricably tied in with a sense of communal belonging, restrictions on religious freedom should only be imposed in a most narrowly tailored way, maximizing the opportunity for worship and practice. And this does raise questions of defining public reason, which I won't get into now, but it's an interesting question. Absolute bans, in our view, on religious gatherings, absolute bans or bans based on strictly fixed numbers of persons are typically not narrowly tailored to an actual threat. So where possible, the recommendation is that restrictions on gatherings should be based on a percentage or on a proportion of attendance capacity relative to the location of the gathering, rather than bans on absolute numbers, irrespective of the size of the facility, which is policy that we've seen in several countries and has been struck down by several courts. Where the extremity of the health risk has been sufficiently demonstrated to justify full bans on religious gatherings and in-person worship, allowance should be made for alternative arrangements. So we recognize that absolute bans may in certain cases be justified, but then public authorities have to look for alternatives. And so those might include socially distanced outside gatherings, sometimes called drive-in gatherings, online stream services, which need to be guaranteed that those can actually happen. And in which cases there needs to be provision for a small number of socially distanced and perhaps masked worship leaders in a particular site to lead those events. And such restrictions, finally, need to be temporary in scope. Public authorities should modulate restrictions in favor of rights as experience and as the understanding of the sanitary threat and associated health risks matures. So as scientific knowledge matures, the public health authorities need to be very quickly reactive to that knowledge in the favor of liberty. Restrictions should be lifted for all religious groups within a reasonable time frame when the health threat has diminished. The second key recommendation is that public health authorities should identify and consult with appropriately designated representatives of religious communities prior, whenever reasonably possible, and we recognize it might not always be possible to have a full consultation process prior to restrictions, but when possible, prior to the imposition of restrictions. Public authorities should identify and consult with representatives of a broad range of religious communities, and where urgent health restrictions require the enactment of restrictions prior to full consultations, those consultations should still be made with all due speed afterwards. They shouldn't be discounted just because they couldn't have taken place beforehand. And such consultations should also include representatives from minority faith communities. And that's an extra impetus, or an extra, rather, requirement on public health authorities, that they need to identify those minorities. They need to have links with those minorities. They need to have some sort of understanding of the internal dynamics of those minorities. And additionally, where appropriate, public authorities may wish to hold public hearings, which provide a forum for underrepresented groups to voice concerns. And that last point speaks to the question of small groups, particularly small groups which might not be easily identified, who might be more appropriately identified or consulted with in a large open public forum. And very briefly, the third recommendation is that restrictions on worship and religious practices should not exceed those imposed on other social settings which present similar characteristics as places of religious worship. Places of religious worship, we recognize, have inherent sanitary risks, but they're no qualitatively different than other forms of secular gatherings. So that includes settings such as sports events or performing arts, public transportations, other recreational or social gatherings. The restrictions on religious gatherings should never exceed the restrictions imposed on those other settings. And that's intended as a minimum standard rather than as a qualitative conflation of religious and non-religious settings and activities. Religion and belief should still be afforded specific protections by virtue not solely of individual autonomy, but of characteristics internal to religious traditions themselves. And finally, and Nick will develop this, that public health concerns should never be invoked to justify what are in truth politically or ideologically or religiously motivated restrictions on freedom of religious and, or of religion or belief. But that's a point that Nick will develop further.
Thank you, Alexei. And I'll briefly go over the three remaining principles. The fourth one really relates to number 3, that no religious community should be unfairly discriminated against as a result of restrictions imposed in the application of necessary health measures. Now, we've previously said that there should be consultation, that religious groups shouldn't be more restricted than similar secular groups, but we recognize that not every religious group will be able to be consulted with, given the number of religious groups and the diversity in many Western countries. And so we need to avoid not only the intentional targeting of religious groups, as number 3 points out, but also the unintentional targeting, just based on insensitivity to the practices of certain minority groups. And this envisions some sort of process whereby minority groups can seek a redress or a hearing if they are having problems, and not just a court hearing, but a hearing that feeds into the policy-making process itself, so that there isn't unintentional targeting of minority religious practices. And this goes along with point number 5 as well. No religious persons or religious community should be stigmatized by public authorities or by majorities as scapegoats for a public health crisis. And we saw this at the early stages of the pandemic in certain places. Church in Korea was accused of being a super spreader event, and maybe there was some restriction and some level of blame, but it seemed to snowball into a much bigger attack on this religious community than was certainly justified. We're also getting into this more and more with the question of the vaccine now. Previously, the main issue was restrictions, but I'd have to say in the last 2 or 3 months, the attention, and since we first drafted this paper, there's been a lot more attention on the question of vaccine and mandatory vaccination. You may have heard just in the last couple of days, the American president has signed an executive order mandating all federal employees be vaccinated, and all private companies with 100 or more employees must mandate vaccination or weekly testing. But the costs and practicalities of the weekly testing put heavy emphasis on the full vaccination. And there is strong and stiff resistance to this in various parts of America, and certainly in some religious communities. And so this question of stigmatization, what we've said before about religion not being an absolute right is clear enough, right? That there need to be restrictions in the names. Your religious right can't cause you to harm your neighbor. But I also think it's equally important as a civil liberties and religious liberty attorney that restrictions not be put into place that are punitive, right? That restrictions be limitations based on public health measures and not on measures meant to punish or coerce individuals to get the vaccine. And sometimes there's a narrow line between the two, but the point is that whatever restrictions are put into place need to be justified, again, as to what Alexi said early on, by reference to actual health needs, not just to making life more difficult for a certain group of people. And our final point is that religious leaders have a vital role to play in fostering a relationship of trust between their followers and the state in matters of public health, and should seek information from qualified sources about the medical basis for vaccination and other preventative public health measures. And really this principle is written to both sides of the equation, right? It's not something that the government can require of religion, or religion can require of government, but we're hopeful that there will be cooperation on both sides in these matters of public urgency. My particular church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, has a long history of taking religious liberty and the separation of church and state in America very seriously. We have the longest running magazine devoted to religious freedom, Liberty Magazine, from the late 1800s. And we're also very health conscious. We have a system of hospitals around the world, and we are supportive of the vaccine. Our worldwide and North American Division Church have encouraged our members to participate in it, but there are a significant minority of our members who are somewhat resistant to it, and we try to respect their individual consciences, but at the same time providing education as to what are legitimate religious liberty interests and what are not. And I just want to close by sharing a little bit about what we've said, or some of us have said, about this freedom of conscience that is now being more frequently raised as the vaccine mandate spread. I noticed I arrived here yesterday and I did a little walk around town, and there was a demonstration in the public square against the vaccines here in Bologna. So this is something that's being experienced in many places, and those particularly from a Protestant tradition will use concepts like freedom of conscience and belief coming from Luther's Priesthood of all believers, and that's the tradition that my church traces its roots to. And so we've been conscious about pointing out that in many ways the Protestant concept of individualism has been maybe hijacked is a too strong a word, but it has been turned into a teaching of hyper-individualism by the rise of secular modernity and the focus on the autonomous individual. And I like to frame this in terms that maybe both Catholics and Protestants can understand. Luther had the concept of the priesthood of all believers, right, which was a good part of his basis for the defense of individual conscience, and famously stood before the Diet of Worms and invoked his conscience and the Bible against the dictates of the majority and the Pope and councils. But what he didn't make was he made a priesthood of all believers, which if you think about it has a communitarian idea to it, doesn't it? It's a priesthood of a group of believers. And in the United States presently, many Protestant evangelical groups tend to treat that concept as like a gathering of popes, right? Where what Luther did was take the locus of authority in the church from the Pope and the cardinals and the priests down to all the believers as a community, whereas many modern-day Protestants want to create a community of popes where everyone is an expert both spiritually and scientifically in their own fields. And a recovery of the Protestant idea of a community that helps the group come to understandings both spiritually, and then he had not to get into too great a detail, but a notion of offices. Even though he did away in a sense with the church hierarchy, he recognized offices for pastors and for priests, people who had training and expertise. And in our community in America, in our church, there are far too many people who are not willing to listen to highly trained and competent either public health authorities or church health authorities, but will listen to whoever on the internet, right, who has no connection with our community, no connection with expertise. And this is a complete misuse of Luther's notion of the priesthood of believers, and again, as a kind of retreat to the sanctity of the autonomous individual, which really is not an idea with roots in our religious communities. So anyway, these are some of the principles that we've set out in our paper. We are gathering some of the best papers that were presented at our little conference they're going to be published in a journal, Fides et Libertas, with Ganoun Diop, who helps oversee that, and we're going to take some of them into a book form as well, and we're looking for more papers at this conference to go along with that book, Religion and the Pandemic. So if anyone's interested, please see Alexi or I afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you, Alexis and Nick, for addressing in such a detailed way the implications of freedom of religion or belief in this particular situation we are all passing through, which is kind of universal. Now we go to a different hemisphere with Professor Juan Navarro Floria from Argentina.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. I wasn't at the Matera meeting that Javier reminded at the beginning, but I was following the words of the meeting, and I fully agree with the conclusions. I believe that the topic that brings us together this morning interests the whole world, and that we can think of challenges that are common to everyone, although the realities and problems of each region may be different. I was wondering that my contribution to this discussion could be, and I think it should be, a look from the reality of Latin America. We cannot forget that there is a fundamental concept, which is the universality of human rights. Also, and very especially, freedom of religion and belief is a right that must be proclaimed and defended throughout the world. America is a continent where the right to religious freedom is widely recognized in laws and constitutions. We have no problem, or no major problem, in that area. However, problems do appear in the concrete and practical life of people. They appear precisely when you want to move from the right to action. They appear when the laws, the states, or some social groups try to impose and force behaviors that are incompatible with the mandates of the conscience of many people, believers or non-believers. Therefore, what is needed is not to recognize religious freedom in general, that already exists, but to examine and guarantee the concrete applications of that freedom. The title of this meeting calls us to move from the proclamation of rights, the right of freedom or of religion and belief, to action. This implies recognizing that religious freedom is not something theoretically or merely a declamation, but is something very practical. Religious freedom has to do with people's lives, with everyday life. It's not only something internal, but has an external dimension. I would like to say, however, that the action has the condition that the right be recognized. And in that sense, I would like to bring here a proposal. For some years now, the Argentine Council for Religious Freedom, of which I'm currently president, and also the Latin American Consortium for Religious Freedom, of which I am a member, like Javier and Cole, have been promoting something that is not new, but that we believe makes sense today. I am referring to the signing of an International Convention on Religious Freedom. We have proposed it as an initiative for the Inter-American human rights system and also for the global system of the United Nations. We believe that a good convention on this matter can help protect the specific applications of religious freedom, both individually and collectively, as the previous speakers said, the gatherings and so on. We all know that this initiative existed in the past at the United Nations. In the 60s of the last century in the United Nations, there were important works with this objective. Initially, racial discrimination and religious discrimination were jointly considered. At some point, it was decided to deal with these two issues separately, although both are often closely related. The effort to combat racial discrimination culminated in the approval of a convention on this matter, as we all know. But with regard to religious freedom, it was hardly possible in 1981 to arrive at an international declaration, which is important, but not entirely satisfactory. It is 40 years from the declaration this year. This year marks the 40th anniversary of that declaration. 40 years ago, the geopolitical situation of the world made it very difficult to move towards a mandatory convention on religious freedom. Some of the obstacles that existed at that time have disappeared, others remain, and perhaps there are new ones now. But at the same time, in these decades, the relevance of religion and the validity of religion has become very evident. If anyone thought that religions were moving towards disappearing, the reality is that religions are increasingly present in international politics. And that happens because religion is still very important to the lives of many people. among the new realities, some are positive. One of them is, despite many difficulties, the advancement of the interreligious dialogue at all levels. This very G20 Interfaith Forum conference is evidence of that. There are many others. I am thinking of the Abu Dhabi Declaration signed between Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar on human fraternity. Last week, we have seen a very important joint message of the Holy Father Francis, His Holiness Bartholomew I, Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, and His Grace Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury, for the protection of creation. These are examples of rapprochement between religious confessions and are in themselves examples of action, also in favor of religious freedom. How do I link this approach and dialogue between religions with the initiative of an international convention? I do it because I believe that such an initiative could possibly gather the will of all religious confessions. All churches and faiths face the same challenges, and they all need religious freedom. The task, therefore, will not be to put the religions, the churches, in agreement among themselves, but above all, to put the states in agreement about the freedom that the religions and the people of faith need. Since 1981, new challenges and problems related to freedom of religion and conscience have appeared, which make it necessary to protect better that freedom. Working at the Religious Freedom Convention can be an opportunity to identify those issues and defenses. It can also be an opportunity to rediscover and insist on the universality of human rights, founded on the common dignity of all human beings. In the case of Latin America, or the whole America, including North America as well, we believe that it's possible to find consensus for a regional convention which may serve later as a precedent for a convention of global scope. But it's also possible to start working directly on that international global convention. That said, there are certainly other areas where we can take action. I mentioned earlier the advances in interreligious dialogue. There is a dialogue that we can call theological, which is very important, of course. But there is also a way of dialogue what is precisely common action. This very G20 Interfaith Forum is an example of the possibilities that this type of dialogue offers. Here we want to identify very important fields, such as caring for the environment, fighting human trafficking, caring of the most vulnerable, and many others. Here we are putting in evidence that a joint work of the religious confessions together between them, with the states and with the academy, is possible. Here we are also showing that religions have a lot to contribute to states, but for that, broad religious freedom is essential, and a positive and constructive outlook towards religions. Religions are not a thing of the past, but a very important vital force to put soul to many actions of states and the international community, from caring for the planet to caring for people's health. In the conclusions of the G20 Interfaith Forum meeting in 2018 in Buenos Aires, it was said achieving longer-term G20 objectives, such as the SDGs, depends on heavy lifting coming from religious communities around the world. Macro goals cannot succeed without micro-implementation, and religious communities are often optimally placed to facilitate advances in reduction of poverty, hunger, provision of health care and education, promotion of decent work and equal treatment, and so on, through the list of SDGs. Firm protections for freedom of religious beliefs are essential. End of the quote. That conclusion remains in full force. I stop here, and I hope to we can talk about these issues now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Juan. Definitely this initiative of the international convention would be definitely a huge action in this area. So lastly, Professor Cole Durham has the floor.
So thank you very much, Javier, and let me apologize that I had to be absent at the beginning. We were welcoming the ACWE, the common word for the youth partner of this conference, and it was important to be there. Let me just begin by thanking our working group that has been working on the freedom of religion or belief issues, and you're seeing many of the leaders of that working group here. The larger structure that we're attempting to develop within the G20 Interfaith Forum entails a series, or involves a series of working groups. I'm looking at Ganun Diop, and we have overarching an initiative against racism. We have working groups that are dealing with health issues, with equality issues. There are several. I'm not going to take the time to go through and name them all, but one of the really important ones is the one that's dealing with freedom of religion or belief. One of the powerful things about the G20 interfaith setting is that it serves as a reminder of the many areas of life in which religion continues to play a vital role. And, you know, in our more secular world these days, secular in some countries, less secular in others, but there's a tendency to forget to appreciate the incredible role that religion plays, often an unspoken, an invisible, an unthanked role, but a vital role in furthering all kinds of social goods. And for religious communities to be optimally effective in doing that, they have to have freedom to do things in their own ways. There are limits. This is not an unbounded freedom or a license to discriminate or to do other kinds of things that are opposed to public policy in significant ways. And we've heard a very sort of careful effort reflecting international norms to reflect the kind of careful balancing that needs to be done when setting the limits. But I just want to thank our working group in this area, which has been particularly effective in thinking about these issues and thinking in refined ways. And what we anticipate will happen is that these various suggestions, we've had a round of discussions earlier in Matera this summer to crystallize a number of the suggestions, and we wanted to have further time over the summer to finalize and pull additional comments and insights together during this conference, and then have a final document that we can also use going forward to Indonesia. I should say that we're very excited moving forward to Indonesia. Indonesia, as you know, is the largest Muslim country on earth, but the leadership is very interesting, very open, very forward-looking, and we think that there will be some very positive developments that will come out of that event. Let me just try to summarize some things that stand out in my mind as I've listened to things, and I'm sorry that I missed Elisabeta's remarks at the beginning. I know a little bit about them, and we've worked on other issues. But I think that it is significant to recognize the universal dimensions of freedom of religion or belief, but also to recognize, as was brought out by Xiaoyun in her talk, that these universal ideas get mediated through practical and civilizational contexts that we have to take advantage of. This does not mean that we can't look critically at each other and to raise concerns, where we see concerns. These are global concerns, and we need to think about things in global ways. But we also need to think creatively and to learn from each other things that have worked in other cultures. I think the Indonesians are proud in many ways of what they've been able to do in their culture, and I think we'll learn some things from thinking about the kinds of things they're trying to do, ways they're trying to have a modern view and at the same time be respectful of their tradition. So I think that's one of the challenges we face, how to, in a global world, really effectuate something like the ideal of freedom of religion and belief, to be able to speak courageously where there are wrongs, but to also try to learn and be sensitive to what others are trying to do and to accomplish. I think one of the things that we're trying to do, we know in this setting that ultimately we need to be able to come up with concrete, practical recommendations. And in some ways, what makes it to the G20 leaders themselves is necessarily some short bullet point type items. And we're grateful for Nick and Alexei for the work that they've done on this very current issue that relates very much to the theme of this conference, the health theme, some of the practical ways that need to be looked at that religious communities are facing in real time and can really be much more effective if they have the right to gather, but if they also have the right to contribute to messaging on vaccines, other kinds of things. There are many positive things that can happen. And at the same time, there will be disagreements. But the truth is that religious communities and the tradition of freedom of religion or belief has a longer tradition of dealing with these challenges than most other human rights or other things that one could propose. I have come to think of freedom of religion or belief as a kind of filtering device which can look at both the positives and the dark side of religion, the ambivalence of the sacred, as Scott Appleby named it in the title of one of his books, and that freedom of religion or belief is one of the best filters we've ever developed in human history to sort out where religion should be taken seriously and given room, and where it is, in rare cases, necessary to impose limits, but that can be done in sensitive ways. I think we've heard some very practical kinds of recommendations that can be carried forward. Let me speak a little bit to the convention idea. This has been an idea in some ways floating around since 1981, because as many of you would know, the 1981 declaration was, it's a very interesting declaration because on the one hand, it's merely a declaration, but if you look at it, it repeats verbatim treaty language from the International Bill of Rights that was reduced to treaty language. It has one section, section 6, that spells things out, things like religious communities have a right to build places of worship or to have access to places of worship. This was not a stretch in terms of what the basic abstract documents meant. And my point is that the declaration, while technically merely a declaration, is as close to being law as one would want. But it's not all the way there. But one of the reasons it's a declaration and not a convention, unlike the CERD, the Racial Discrimination Covenant, is that it's hard. There's a range of religious views. The politics of this is complicated. It's been complicated from the beginning, and it remains complicated in some ways. And one of the problems is that as some people have thought about the right to a convention, there is a risk that you would not raise the level, but you would sort of lower the level of what is already there. One of the reasons, the idea of starting with the Western Hemisphere is that some of the problems that have turned out to be blocks at the level of the United Nations, either the, well, I won't go into the political complexities, but many of those things don't arise in the Western Hemisphere. And so it's a good starting point. We also have the alliance of, I'm not going to get the name exactly right, but the current alliance in favor of freedom of religion or belief, which has been signed on to by around 30 countries. That's another group which could provide impetus for doing something. But it is an opportunity to think about starting points. And also, as Juan was pointing out, part of what's needed is addressing concrete issues. These are places where there are hard issues, but where there are opportunities for dialogue and paying attention to things. So maybe that's enough said. I know we're running low on time, but I think, again, I want to thank this working group in particular. It's one that's close to my heart, as many of them people here would know. And I really hope that we will, not only this year, but in continuing years, be able to find concrete ways to improve freedom of religion or belief around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cole, for your optimistic views of things. Understanding difficulties as opportunities is a very sensible way of looking at things, and also for underscoring the implicit risks in the project of an international convention, lowering the standards instead of raising them. So we are over the time, but if there are some comment or question from the audience, we can devote a few minutes to it. If not, are there any comments or questions? Please, you could introduce yourself briefly.
No, it's only an initiative. It's not we are not working concretely. In fact, the Argentine Council for Religious Freedom has proposed this idea of the convention or a declaration in the Inter-American system of human rights in the Organization of American States. We made a proposal of that. But well, we are working with some governments to move in this, but it's a very initial work. We are not working concretely. We need to convince the governments to work on this. In the Inter-American system, we are thinking that this is the first step for further work at the global level.
That's a very good strategy. I mean, if you succeed in doing something at the inter-American level, that could be as a sort of example to be followed by the global community. Any other question?
Thank you so much for your question. This is going to remain challenge until 23 for us in trying to work on this issue to raise awareness in such a way that we are not raising the fear of people inside of the communities for not coming to attend religious services. So it will remain challenge, but right now I cannot say much about that because we are at the early stage of this process. Maybe after some experience in the next few months, we will see how it goes. But we still could see that some churches, because of the EU legislation and this special EU action plan, some states have already taken steps, like Finland, like Sweden, in Bulgaria as well. So there are some communities who already have these security plans for their religious objects. So for some it is new initiative, for some it is not. But it somehow helps to all religious communities coming together. So there is also a very positive component, you know, like in working in the time of peace, knowing each other just in case something unpredictable happens. So, and this is really what we want to emphasize, that working together we can prevent many things badly happening.
So, of course, it would be ideal if religious communities would entirely act responsibly and determine their own safeguards and guidelines. But when we say that religious freedom isn't an absolute right, it's a recognition that the state has some appropriate role in setting down safeguards for public safety. Churches are generally covered by, for instance, fire code requirements, right, in terms of public safety. And I think Alexei and I see the need at times for the government in a pandemic to set down rules which will apply everywhere, including churches, because if the churches don't set down the right rules, then they become the super spreader events that impact the larger community. And I think that's the only justification the state needs. If your private actions are actually endangering and harming others, then it has a sufficient basis to act. I don't know if Alexei would add anything to that.
Yeah, just briefly, when you phrase it like that, in my mind, it echoes the principle of subsidiarity within Catholic social teaching, and I think that's attractive to a certain extent, with maybe the caveats that it's both the prerogative and it's incumbent upon the sovereign, however the sovereign's organized, to establish binding rules, to establish law. And I suppose there's maybe a concern about a certain form of co-optation, a certain form of instrumentalization of religious organizations, were we to entirely depend upon them to pronounce and apply those restrictions. Because if they were doing it in a completely autonomous way, then they wouldn't be co-opted. But as Nick says, well, we can't really do that. But if they're just the mouthpieces for the states, then that gets into risky territory about instrumentalization or co-optation, that they're no longer truly autonomous. So there needs to be that balance between a certain group autonomy and a certain keeping them within the general rules of the public will, the common will.
Let me just add that I think your question was also who should be articulating the rules. I think there's no question that these public rules come from the public sector, but what was really significant, I think in many ways, about their proposal is recognizing, A, that there should be dialogue and working these things out jointly, and two, because you can't have 2,000 people at the table working things out, that there ought to be something like a hearing process or some channel where smaller groups can register their concrete concerns. And that's a way of making sure that the government is fulfilling its role, but fulfilling it in a maximally sensitive way. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I may add, when you said, Nick, that it will be naive to think that every religious community will act responsibly and rationally, probably is naive to think also that all governments will have to act responsibly and rationally as a sort of, yeah, by default. So it's, let's be honest, because sometimes we think, well, religious communities are very, what about governments? They are not always the most enlightened people in the world. So that's why this dialoguing process and reflection, and also the academic freedom to speak with actual freedom, without restriction. We have seen a lot of not declared restrictions on the freedom of people to express themselves in this period of pandemic, and that should be crucial, in my opinion. Any other question or comment from the audience? So then, so thanks to all the speakers for your interventions, for being here, also to Xiao Yun from China. If she's still there, we cannot see you. Hopefully you could hear. So thanks to all of you.